From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson. You're hearing only my voice right now, but in a few moments you will hear the voice of Dr. Matthijs Tieleman. He is a scholar at Illinois State University, a former postdoc at the Center for American Institutions, which sponsors this podcast, and he is a scholar of what he calls the Patriot Atlantic. I'm going to let him explain to you what that actually is, but anybody who's interested in the American Revolution will find it fascinating. I'm doing this quick introduction because there was some technical difficulties in the recording of this episode. So, especially the first 30 minutes or so are there are some spots that I wish had gone a little bit better. We were using new technology or at least unfamiliar technology, and it didn't quite pan out as we hoped it would. After about the 25-minute mark, it gets really solid and you don't have to worry about it anymore. I think I've done enough editing so that in the first 25 minutes or so, it should hold together pretty well, but there are a couple of awkward pauses. We also lost the entire introduction. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Dr. Matthijs Tieleman, who is again at Illinois State University, a former postdoc here at the Center for American Institutions. He was doing his part of the interview from Normal, Illinois. And so, really, what you missed at the beginning is just a little bit of banter about weather. All right, I'm going to stop talking right now, let him talk, and hopefully you enjoy the episode. I think it's a really good one. However, I do beg your indulgence for a couple of moments in the first 20 minutes or so. All right, thank you very much. So, Dr. Tillman, are you able to tell us your research is on the transatlantic connections in the early modern period, particularly in nationalist and patriot movements, correct?
Yeah, and actually, not so much nationalist. We can get into that, but yes, the patriot movements. That's correct.
Okay, so how would you distinguish patriot from nationalist? Let's start there.
So typically, when scholars discuss nationalism, usually they think of this as a 19th or modern era phenomenon. And really, what patriotism is in my book, um, not just figuratively in my book, but also literally in my book, is basically sort of a form of an ideology that preceded nationalism. And has some overlaps, but also some distinct features that make it more early modern rather than modern.
Okay, so what would some of those distinct features be?
Okay, so when we think of nationalism, right, we think of people loving their country, right? That's sort of the basic, you know, the basic understanding of what nationalism is. And patriotism is has that feature, but it's not so much country. It can mean a whole lot of different things. So patriotism, this is why the American revolutionaries called themselves patriots. It's also why the Dutch and the Irish, which we can talk about, called themselves patriots in the same period in the late 18th century, is that they had a distinct love for for their communities writ large, right? So that could be their city, it could be their colony, it could be the empire, the British Empire in this particular case. And so the idea of a community that you love and that you have a particular feeling towards is different from nationalism, which tends to be purely about the nation as the sole object of love, if that makes sense. There's many more elements to patriotism, though, which we can discuss if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'm going to leave it open ended. I'll let you go where you want to go here.
Sure, sure. Well, I don't want to, I don't want to go on a long rant on, on patriotism without, giving you a break to sort of steer, if you'd like. But yeah, so patriotism is not just the love for the community, but it's also it's also connected to certain types of institutions and a mode of politics, so how politics is conducted. And that is also distinctively early modern and different from nationalism, right? So when we think of nationalism, we don't just think of love of country, but also this the ultimate objective is the creation of a nation state, right? So that government and the nation as a community are basically overlapping and interlinked, right? So that the people of a nation control the state and therefore exercise their sovereign will. And this is a very modern concept, and it's one that we continue to struggle and debate. In the early modern period, though, with this patriotism in the end of the 18th century, what you see is that a distinct set of institutions emerge in this patriot Atlantic, as I call it, that are not necessarily organized around a central state. And this is also one of the reasons the US, which is the only country really that survived the Patriot Atlantic period. So in the Netherlands, you have a revolution, in Ireland, you have a revolution, but they ultimately fail, whereas the American one succeeds. Um, you see basically a mix of different types of institutions being created. One of the ones that is very prominent is the militia, right? And this is one of the origins of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The Patriots held the militias in great regard across the Atlantic. We're talking about also Ireland and the Dutch Republic, and of course the United States. And so you see the militia as this kind of symbolic, not just symbolic, it's both a symbol and a real institution in which citizenship is being conducted in a way that you wouldn't see under a nationalist system, where typically people, even if is some kind of warrior ethos, it's usually conducted through a national army, and that's not necessarily seen as part of citizenship. But that is true for the Patriots. And you see this also when you look at the Constitution of the United States. The early constitutions, right, under the Articles of Confederation, you had multiple states that had their constitutions, and they designed it in a way that is that you have a sort of shared sovereignty, right? So the United States, under the Constitution, even today, has a sort of shared sovereignty. Even though the federal government is, right, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, the states retain lots of powers, right? And so that is a remnant of this Patriot Atlantic, that you have an allegiance to a certain sense of the central government, but there's also an identity and a citizenship of a local government. Those are really critical portions of patriotism, and sort of the remnants of it.
Interesting. I was actually my you anticipated what my question was gonna be, which is fantastic, in that I was gonna I think we all kinda have in our heads that nationalist movements end with some form of centralization,
Yeah,
or at least associated with some form of centralization. But the way that you're suggesting it, these patriot movements lend itself more to you can see the genesis of the idea of federalism, which shared sovereignty in a federal structure is pretty novel in the US Constitution, correct?
yeah, correct. So this is one of the reasons why there was so much pushback by the anti-federalists against the Constitution, because they believed that that the Constitution itself was a violation of the principles of the American Revolution. But even if you compare the Constitution as it came out in 1787 and then ratified in 88, went into effect 89, um, that was considerably more decentralized than any state in Europe that emerges in the modern period. I mean, they just all become unitary states, and that wasn't. I mean, the Dutch Republic famously was a decentralized state, right? The Irish patriots, they make the case that no, we're a separate kingdom, right? And we need to have our own parliament. But that all ends, like the British government, they give them the parliament, but after another rebellion that's largely based on the French Revolution, they take control and they just abolish Irish Parliament entirely. So you see a massive centralization take place in Europe in the 19th century. And that's something that the US also goes through to a certain extent, but there's a lot more push and pull on it and it wasn't intended as such, for sure.
Interesting. Okay, so maybe a good place to really penetrate this distinction between patriot and nationalist is with Ireland. Maybe we
Yeah.
start there. How, you
Yeah.
mentioned that there's this early Irish patriot movement that I think we can distinguish from the Irish nationalists that I think people would be more familiar with of the 20th century. How would you distinguish between these two movements?
Oh, that is a great question. So the Irish patriots are traditionally, well, actually, all of them are Protestants. So whereas the nationalists are not. So the
That's a
Irish
good difference.
patriots, yeah, yeah, especially in Ireland, the vast majority of Irish people in the 18th century were Catholics, but they'd had no power. They were excluded from power. So you'd think they'd be the one to complain about it. And of course they did. But the people who also complained were basically what you call, some of them were called undertakers, but really they were Irish Protestants. There's a mix of them. Some of them were up in Ulster, which is what's now Northern Ireland, right? That's still part of the United Kingdom. And a lot of them were also in Dublin and other cities. And these were basically Anglican colonists or English and Scottish colonists from the 17th century, some of the 16th century, and they started to see themselves as Irish, and they held political power. They could vote, some of them anyway. They were the ones serving in Irish Parliament, but they felt disenchanted by the monarch, by George III, and by British Parliament. And though they had a parliament themselves, the Parliament of Ireland, it basically needed approval from British Parliament in order to get anything passed. And a lot of the laws disadvantaged the Irish Protestants in their mind. And so they fought for reforms, uh, but not really for Irish Catholics. That became a debate though in the 1780s, and it kind of tore them apart. And in fact, that debate is not all that different, both in the approach of the Irish patriots, and the way they tried to solve it is very similar to how the American patriots dealt with the issue of slavery. It's a very similar dynamic.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, I'm trying to think of, and this is showing my own ignorance of Irish history here. I'm, but I'm, I think of the sympathy that Edmund Burke has for the American colonists, the American patriots, and of course, Edmund Burke's an Irishman serving in the British Parliament. Okay, so Burke be kind of representative of at least an aspect of this Irish patriot movement. Is that correct?
Yeah, Burke always held because he was kind of an old Whig, so he had those sympathies, and a lot of the old Whigs had sympathy for patriotism, but they were never fully. At least in my book, there are some scholars with whom I obviously disagree on this, who would say that Whiggism so Whiggism is kind of older, right, going all the way back to 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, that Whiggism and patriotism is actually sort of the same. I disagree on this. Burke ultimately, although you are right that there is a link there, Burke ultimately was very establishment thinking. So while he sympathized with the American colonies and the colonists, especially before independence, he wasn't very enthusiastic about the idea of revolution itself. He was always he was the conservative, right? He don't change things too fast type of guy, and he had the same approach to the Irish Patriots. So there's even, in the 1780s, there are these Irish Patriots who complain that Burke is neglecting them in British Parliament, saying, "Hey, dude, you're one of us, right? You're an Irish Protestant." And yeah, and then Burke replies in a pamphlet saying that he isn't. um, and so, but and then he gives some reasons why not. And as always, Burke was very poignant, and he, I don't think he was deliberately ignoring them or thinking they didn't have a point, but he wasn't entirely on their side either, if that makes sense. So much like the American revolutionaries, he kind of, he said, well, they got a point.
Sure, sure. So how would you then maybe we can go a little bit further then in distinguishing patriotism from Whiggism?
So Whiggism comes to the fore really as a kind of resistance against James II in the 17th century, King James II, who tries to basically rule, but as an absolute monarch, right? Based on Louis XIV's French model. And Parliament invites William III, the Dutch stadtholder, and his wife Mary, who was James's Protestant daughter, over. He himself was a Catholic, over, and they kick him out. That's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And in return, they accept the Bill of Rights as it limits the power of the monarch, basically makes the power of Parliament permanent, and settles all these constitutional disputes that they had over the 17th century. Monarch and Parliament had all these disputes, civil war, all kinds of problems. And Whiggism is basically the ideology that supports this, the idea that king and parliament are balanced, and that Protestantism that Protestantism is of the highest importance. A Protestant crown is of the highest importance to Britain, and that this institution and this balance between the king and parliament needs to be defended. It kind of expands into the system in which you get a prime minister, right? The first prime minister, Robert Walpole, kind of emerges out of this system where parliament has so much power that the king needs to have someone in parliament, because he can't enter it himself, to pass legislation. And that's basically what the prime minister does, right? He's the king's representative in parliament to pass legislation. And so the Whigs emerge from this system that you have a balance between Parliament and King, and Parliament is effectively supreme in this relationship. Now, what ends up happening in the early 18th century is that you have critics rise to the fore of the system, right? They say these are called the radical Whigs, or sometimes the Country Party. And these radical Whigs, they basically say, well, look, yeah, this is great. We love this. We love the Glorious Revolution, and we love this parliamentary balance. It's just it no longer exists, right? So you have guys like John Trenchard, right? He writes the Cato Letters, very big, influential set of pamphlets that are very widely read by the American revolutionaries. So, they love the Cato Letters. And it's basically this constitutional critique of the Whigs, right? And of the system that came into being after 1688. And they're saying, look, this system corrupts the ideals of Whiggism, right? Of this balance, because the king is doling out positions to people to get legislation passed, right? He's using his power to, I don't know, appoint the lieutenant governor of North Carolina and gives it to people's cousins just so that he can get a piece of law passed, right? And so they're saying the king is too active in parliament. The parliament is not a counterweight to the king; it's the king's tool, right? And that's corrupt. And so that's the critique of Parliament, that the executive has essentially corrupted the legislature and vice versa. And so while it is true that fundamentally uh, patriotism kind of comes out of this radical Whig tradition in part, and so it shares some origins with Whiggism, right? They both love the Glorious Revolution, essentially, but it's kind of a critique within Whiggism, if that makes sense. Like patriotism is kind of like an offshoot of it, because it critiques Whiggism for its failure to stand up to corruption, for its failure to protect rights and liberties. Um, and so that's what the American revolutionaries and also the Dutch revolutionaries in their context and the Irish revolutionaries in their context, that's what they try to restore, right? That was their argument, restoring rights and liberties. That's the fundamental argument that the patriots make. That's what patriotism
Interesting.
seeks to do.
Okay, restoration of rights and liberties. I like that. I really like that. Okay, so maybe we can go in a little bit into the history of the Patriots in Ireland. We've talked a little bit about them. What happens to them? You touched on it a little bit before, but maybe you could go into a little more.
So, well, everybody's familiar. Well, not everybody, but I assume most listeners are familiar with the American Revolution. So I won't touch too much on that, other than to connect them basically to the Dutch and the Irish. So uh, the Dutch, they come out of a tradition really, again, similar to what the Americans experience and what the Irish experience, which is the idea that the country is in decline, right? This is the sense, the sort of despair that the country is no longer functioning, that the original constitution is no longer working, and that this needs to be restored. The Dutch in the mid 1740s experienced great number of corruption cases. The economy is going down the drain. And in response, what they do, they consider it as an oligarchy, not so much associated with the political left these days, but that's the word they use because it's basically these merchants, for instance. So I'll give you a case of corruption. So these merchants and bankers, they basically control the political system and profit off of it, right? So you'll have a banker, for instance, that is also some guy who works in, let's say you have an Amsterdam banker who also is in the Amsterdam city government, and then the Amsterdam city government needs to borrow money, and then he borrows it from himself, basically. So he says, I got money, and then so they profit off the system. Um, and this goes, they appoint, they need a postmaster, and then they appoint their 3-year-old toddler's grandsons, this kind of stuff. And at the same time, while they're doing all this corruption, the economy is going down. And so the Dutch merchants, like sort of the middle classes, they feel that that their country is being betrayed by this class, right? So you have this palpable sense that there's corruption going on everywhere, right? That the economy is going down the drain. There's a small group of elites that have a tight hold on politics, that are profiting off the system. The country, which in the 17th century was the most powerful in Europe, is no longer as powerful. There's basically all there is wars, problems, decline, corruption. And so what they do is they look towards a guy, to a position and a branch of the government called the stadtholderate. Now this position had been empty because traditionally the different states elected this person, and they had traditionally come from the Orange family. That's currently where the current king of the Netherlands comes from as well. But William III, the same guy from the Glorious Revolution, he had died child, and so they find one of his cousins who was a stadtholder in the northern provinces. Long story, um, and they basically have a revolution in 1747. It's called the Orangist Revolution, to put this guy in charge. And the idea was, and this also is very prominent in the American colonies and also in Ireland, which is the idea of this, called the idea of the Patriot King. And it's basically what the American presidency is based on. The notion that the executive branch is this disinterested, meaning no party affiliation. He is a neutral guy who oversees the executive branch, rises above parties, above factions, and uses his love for the country on its own, right? Or for the community, for the city and its history and its traditions and helps restore the ancient privileges, the ancient rights of the cities, of the provinces, and the constitution of the Dutch Republic. So they elevate this guy William the Fourth, who wasn't very good at doing this, and so it fails. But the problem is, so what ended up happening is he gets in charge and then he just basically continues the system. He disappoints people. He says, well, like I just gonna put my guys in charge. And so the decline, the sense of corruption, it continues. Now, this kind of stays dormant, this idea of revival, of restoration, until the American Revolution, right? So in the 1760s, you have the Townshend Acts, famously, right? The laws that block, or that not block, but that tax trade between the American colonies and other places. And one of the big constituents, or one of the big number of merchants going to the American colonies, were Dutch merchants, right? And so they were really deeply connected to the American colonies. And they too were hunted down by British authorities for trying to essentially smuggle goods to the American colonies. And what do you know? The stadtholder, right, William the Fourth's wife,
Mhm.
was Anne, the sister of King George III. And their son at this point, William the Fifth, was not essentially, he was a first cousin of George III. So the stadtholder and the British monarchy were very closely tied together. Now, what ends up happening is that Dutch merchants, again, the economy is still declining. There's still this palpable sense of corruption. And the American colonies, in their mind, and you see this, the Dutch economy starts to rely more and more on the Atlantic trade. And as they're being hunted down by by the Royal Navy, right, by British tax collectors, they're like, wait a minute, we want to just trade, and the British are trying to drag us down with it, right? And so in the 1760s, you see that Dutch merchants and also Dutch people in general start to sympathize with the American colonists and their resistance against these British taxes. And then when the war breaks out, the British try to get Dutch troops to fight in America. When independence happens, there's this incredible support coming out of all these cities, right? They're all supporting, they're helping American colonists try to hide, they're shipping weapons, right? In Before the war, they're shipping the tea, right? The famous Boston Tea Party was basically caused by these Dutch smugglers. And so you have this really, really deep integration of Dutch merchants, of Dutch patriots in the American Revolution. And so when the American Revolution breaks out and all these ideals become public, the Dutch patriots see similarities, right? And they start their own revolution in the 1780s. And that's when you see them copying American constitutions. They form militias, and they literally say that they're basing this on the American model.
People, when they think of countries in Europe that are immediately following the American Revolution, and there's at least a group trying to copy them, it's the French Revolution. And I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about the Dutch Revolution in the 1780s in a second. But I do want to go back to this notion of the interconnectedness between the Dutch commerce, at least, and Dutch merchants, and the Americans. Because if you read so much of the revolutionary, or the literature in the pre-revolutionary period and during the revolutionary period in America, the example of the Dutch is brought up continuously, and the palpable sense of
Yes.
disappointment is brought up continuously in the ability of the Dutch not to, or for the failure of maybe
Uh,
you would call the 1740s Dutch patriot experiment.
Yeah, no, that's right. There is a and I mean the Dutch example gets referenced by the Americans several times. So you have the Dutch example which they greatly admire, of resistance against the Spanish back in the 16th century, which they also see as this longer history of resistance of liberty versus tyranny, right? But yeah, there's also this complete sense that the Dutch Republic is declining, and there is this sort of in the I think in the 1780s and 1770s, there's American revolutionaries are still kind of hopeful that it might actually work. But you see by the late 1780s, Madison famously writes this whole Federalist paper on, and it's actually funny. It's published around the time that the Dutch Patriot Revolution gets suppressed by a Prussian invasion, and he's basically saying, well, these Dutch guys, they're not following the right model here, and we shouldn't fall into their trap. So basically, during the 1780s, so you have to keep in mind, so unlike the French Revolution, which we can talk about too, there's far fewer connections actually, and there's far tangible connections with the French and the Americans than the Americans and the Dutch, also ideologically. But what ends up happening, so unlike the French, which happens in 1789, the Dutch Patriot Revolution happens at the same time as the American Revolution is. And what you see happening is war breaks out. So the American Revolutionary War actually expands to the Dutch Republic. There's a war between Great Britain and the Dutch Republic starting in the 1780s. You have this revolution, right? The Patriots overthrow governments in local towns and cities and provinces, and these guys start to arm themselves. They start to form militias. Right? They cite Second Amendment like clauses in their pamphlets from the American Revolution. But of course, if you get a bunch of guys with guns, and you go up against another guy who is the stadtholder in this case, who is the commander, who was the captain general, so the commander in chief of the army, and admiral general, so of the navy. Um, yeah, you're gonna have these feelings of civil war, right? So that is what happened, right? People are scared that there's going to be civil war. The stadtholder goes to the east, and Wilhelmina thinks she can maybe negotiate, right? So she travels tries to get back to The Hague, and she gets stopped at near Gouda, which listeners probably know as Gouda from the cheese. Um, and she gets arrested. She gets exposed to a drawn sword, which was dishonorable, and she wasn't allowed to relieve herself in private, which was also dishonorable. And so she eventually gets released, and she writes a letter to her family, to the Prussian royal family, and says, "Look, I've been dishonored. My husband's power is decreasing day by day. You need to come in and help restore order." And so they come in, they mobilize, they tell the Patriots, look, if you don't disarm, we'll invade. And the Patriots say, well, give it your best.
Hi, this is me again jumping in. Sorry to do this, but I just think it's important for the listener to understand that there's going to be a very awkward transition here. What happened is that at this moment the technology totally failed us, and we basically had to just stop the interview. We picked it up about a week later, and the rest of the interview will be from the following week. But anyway, so what you've heard is an analysis of the Dutch Revolution in the 1780s. There's going to be a little bit of repetition following when I cut myself off here, but it's still, I think, very, very helpful. Anyway, sorry again to interrupt. Hopefully, you're enjoying the episode. I promise you the audio gets much better from here. Thank you. So anyway, last week where we left off was you were explaining the Dutch Revolution of the 1780s. And I hate to
Yes.
make you jump right into it, but
Sure.
could you maybe begin by, I mean, we're going to recover some ground here, but going back and explaining the the Dutch Revolution of the 1780s, its origins and its eventual culmination.
Yeah, sure. So I left off with 1747. I think I talked about that for.
Yeah,
Does you want me to just start that all over again?
we can just start that all over again.
Okay. So you have to imagine that the Dutch Patriots come out of a similar stream of intellectual history and a similar kind of socioeconomic political environment as the American revolutionaries. So they're reading similar things. They're reading John Locke. They are reading the Cato letters, right? They're reading Bolingbroke in this early 18th century. And as the 18th century progresses, there's basically a decline in the Dutch economy, particularly, and also a decline in political cleanliness, if you will. So there's lots of political corruption. People are doling out jobs. There's an oligarchy really that controls all positions, and it's kind of connected to the banking industry as well. So and war fighting. So wars that are fought, particularly in alliance with Great Britain, are often financed by people who also run the government, right? So it's kind of like people borrowing money from themselves while being in the government. And meanwhile, regular people, especially merchants and middle class people attached to the mercantile industry, they're losing money. So they rise up in revolt in 1747, claiming that the country is too corrupt, that there's decline, and that the original constitution needs to be restored. And only the stadtholder, which was an office that sort of an executive office that had been empty for a really long time, unfilled. Only he could rise up and be a nonpartisan leader, really, and restore Dutch greatness and bring back the Dutch Republic from the brink. And the problem with that revolution was that while the stadtholder came back, he did not actually do those things. So he was very disappointing in the sense that he took away all these guys from their positions, but he filled them with his own cronies. And meanwhile, the economy kept declining in the 1750s into the 1760s. Now, the one bright spot was the Atlantic trade, and especially with North America. So the East India trade, right, the Asia trade, where the Dutch had become rich in the 17th century, that was actually smaller than the Atlantic trade by the 1760s, 1770s. And it was declining, whereas the American trade was growing. Now, when the American Revolution happens, right, when they start cracking down on American patriot smuggling, the smuggling that they do, of course, is with Dutch merchants, right? And so you see the British cracking down on Dutch merchants as well, and therefore cracking down on this sort of one bit of the economy that creates that's regenerative, right? That's actually experiences growth. And so you see in the 1760s and 1770s, when Americans start to protest the British, the Dutch essentially start to empathize with and sympathize really with the American Revolutionary cause, and see themselves in a similar struggle as the Americans have with the British, and they start to see the British as an obstacle to Dutch greatness. Now, it starts to really take off after the breakout of the Revolutionary War, because this is when the Dutch smuggling intensifies, especially around firearms. So lots of firearms move towards North America for obvious reasons. The British, for obvious reasons, crack down harder during the war. Um, and the British even tried to use troops from the Dutch Republic that they had loaned to them 200 years prior against the American revolutionaries. And this mobilizes this movement in the Dutch Republic that they're being abused by the British, and that they're being abused against liberty loving Americans, right? And so that's when this movement starts to take shape. Now, there's lots of diplomatic disputes in the 1770s, but eventually in 1780, late 1780, the British declare war on the Dutch, on the Dutch Republic. Essentially, it's called the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, and it essentially extends the American Revolutionary War to the North Sea. It's a naval war predominantly. It goes horribly for the Dutch. They're absolutely terrible. The one big battle that they celebrate is the one where it was a draw, and if that's the battle you celebrate, you're not doing well. And that's when
I mean, to be fair, the Serbs celebrate a battle they lost.
the Serbs have their way of celebrating things that are interesting. where the Dutch are not quite there. But yeah, so what ends up happening is they go into war, and so the American recognizing American independence becomes more palatable. Also, which they do in 1782. Um, and they give the Americans a big loan. So there's actually kind of an alliance formed between the United States and the Dutch Republic, and furthermore, calls for greater reform increase. And so you see militias that are encouraged to rise up. They say, "Oh, arm yourselves," just like the Americans, right? The leaders of the revolution say this, and they overthrow local cities and local provincial governments, and eventually they sort of take control over most of the republic, setting up a major confrontation with the stadtholder, who was allied with the British and related to the British. He was George III's cousin. And then eventually, the Civil War is kind of at the standstill. The wife of the stadtholder, Wilhelmina of Prussia, tries to go to The Hague, to the west, to sort of negotiate with the Patriots, but they arrest her, and dishonor her, and she writes to her family, the king of Prussia, the monarchy there, to intervene and restore her husband's authority, which he does. So in 1787, with the full might of the Prussian army, the Patriots get crushed. And that in I know that it was a very long story, but it seems long, but that is in short what the Patriot Revolution is about.
So after 1788, and the Prussians have
Uh-huh.
come in and crushed the nascent Dutch patriots,
Mhm.
the 1790s are going to see a period of pretty considerable, I want to say instability in Europe, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
So, what happens to the patriots in the coming, wars of the French Revolution and finally the Napoleonic Wars?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what happens is, so a bunch of them they get disarmed first by the government, and then many of them get exiled. A large portion of them end up in northern France, and keep in mind this is in '87, late '87, early '88. The French Revolution hadn't happened yet, right? So they're being put in royal France. But also some of them, some leaders, they end up in the United States. Most of them in New York with the support of American revolutionary leaders. Now, what happens after the French Revolution breaks up is essentially, or breaks out rather, not breaks up, breaks out, is essentially that the Dutch Republic under the stadtholder is one of the reactionary powers, right? It allies itself with the Austrians and others that want to contain the French Revolution, but they do so unsuccessfully. In 1795, the French Revolutionary armies crush the armies of the stadtholder. The stadtholder flees to Britain, and they bring with them these former patriots. But the problem is that by 95, the revolutionary language has completely changed. So, as I mentioned with you earlier about what patriotism is, right? Yeah, that's no longer the type of revolutionary language that they're using. Between 87 and 95, you've had the rise and fall of the Jacobins and the radical egalitarianism that came with it. And you have generally the French model of state centralization, of egalitarianism, of nationalism, and that basically just completely changes the discourse, and therefore patriotism in the Netherlands is kind of dead. Now, you do have discussions because the French essentially abolished the Dutch Republic, and they create, or them and these invade Dutch invaders basically create the new uh, government called a new republic called the Batavian Republic, but nobody really knew what kind of model they wanted to follow. So they have these constitutional debates whether they want a centralized state based on the French model or a federal state like the American one. But nobody really wanted any of this. They did some referendums and proposed constitutions that was voted down, and eventually the French are done with it. They collaborate with the Unitarians, as they called it. That's not Unitarians, the religion, but Unitarians as the centralized state guys, the pro-French ones, basically. They commit a series of coups, arrest everybody who disagrees with them, and create a unitary state in the Batavian Republic. They then reform it in 98, I think, or early 19th century. I kind of forgot about that, to be honest. They create the Batavian Commonwealth, which is yet another product, even more French controlled. Um, and then Napoleon creates the Kingdom of Holland, puts his brother in charge. And after that, after a while, he's done with it because his brother's not doing what he wants, and he just incorporates it into France. But by that point, the Patriots were gone. They had long been gone. Their ideas were gone. They were no longer making the argument for ancient rights and privileges. They were no longer making the argument for restoring the Dutch Republic's original constitution because the Dutch Republic was gone. So the Dutch patriotism just goes away and it's swept away by nationalism, by egalitarianism, by the French model of the nation state.
Hmm. That's really interesting, and I had never thought of it in those terms before. You sort of I mean, I'm not an expert on this period, but I kind of I think like most people sort of see the French Revolution as being a deviant offshoot maybe of the American Revolution. For
How so? In what way?
Well, in the sense that it was initially possessed by these original by similar ideas, and then just partly the environment, partly the partly circumstance, and partly the perhaps the the millennia of unique French institutions uh lead to this far more violent, far more disruptive revolution. Burke might argue that it was because of, a more radical interpretation of the Enlightenment or something like that. And I guess I sort of see it, had initially seen it in that world, but I'd always sort of seen the American Revolution and French Revolution as cousins, if not siblings, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I mean, there's yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
no, but I was just gonna say, but the way that you've explained this to me, what you're describing is that the French Revolution looks a lot more like seems very distinct from the American Revolution in ancestry.
Yes, yes. Maybe not as much in ancestry initially. So when you look at the French Revolution from 89 to 91, there were all kinds of indications that could make you point out and say, look, you could say Burke, because Burke wrote it at the even 89, 90, right? That was the debate between him and Paine. You could make the argument, well, Burke was wrong in 89 because, these guys weren't chopping off the king's head yet, right? They weren't going full price controls. They weren't going, you know, or they weren't abolishing slavery yet, right? They weren't going wholesale societal change. Um, and I think you could very well make the argument that initially there was a form of I mean, there were patriots, French patriots. Marquis de Lafayette is a great example, right, of someone who would definitely fit the patriot mold, this kind of elite, genteel, yes, we need change, but not so great, right? But the problem with the French model had always been that you can't apply patriotism to France really well because if you say we want to recoup rights and liberties from ancient times, there weren't any. And this is kind of what Burke's point is. He says, well, you have these traditions in France, but the tradition in France was state centralization in the monarchy, right? It was state centralization in Paris or in Versailles, but um, directed from a top-down directed system. And there was no talk of liberty. It was about the state is me, right? I am the state, right? That was Louis XIV's model. And so they didn't really have that to go back to. And so that, which is also why when you see in this early phase, you have the America and the Angloman, the Angloman, I think Angloman, they debate, right? They debate, would should we pursue an American model or an English model as a constitution? But that debate alone demonstrates the lack of heritage, right? It shows that you have to look outside for what you want to do. But that inherently creates this idea of, okay, we need to start over, right? And that was not what the Patriots wanted. They didn't want to start over. They wanted to continue or reimagine, and not even reimagine, recoup lost liberties. And I think that's where the French Revolution just goes off because they needed to change things, and that led to this radicalism in part.
Interesting. Um, w- is there any connection between that need to recoup or recover? I mean, I think that the other revolution that I think shows a similar trajectory in the early modern era, at least to the French Revolution, is the English Revolution. At the end
You
of the
mean 1688?
no, in English Civil War,
Okay, all right.
right? There's a you know there is a radicalizing force in the New Model Army, the Levelers. You could easily imagine a Jacobin club. It's a Jacobite thinking England, apparently, for it
Yeah, yeah.
right there. Um, a Jacobin club emerging in London in the 1640s. And arguably
Sure.
something similar did emerge, if not quite in the same form.
Sure.
Um, and but there, and were Cromwell was maybe in some ways a moderating force, in other ways he was an accelerating force. But that revolution is so wrapped up in Cromwell in a way that maybe even it's not in France with Robespierre. It might even be the
Yeah, it's bigger than Robespierre.
right. Um, but interestingly, like if you probably and I haven't looked at it, I don't know that much about it, but in the 1640s in England, it's not about there's some recovery of privileges, some recovery of parliamentary privileges, but it is still kind of nebulous, right?
Yeah.
In a way that it isn't nebulous in America in the 1770s, or
Right.
the way that you're explaining in the Netherlands of the 1780s. There are distinct, tangible rights and privileges they can point back to. If you're a tanner in London in the 1640s, I'm sure there's some rights you could point back to, but not very many.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess you could go back to, I don't know. You could go back to 1066, or,
Well, yeah, but
you
the
could,
very distant past, right?
yeah,
And
that's
sorry,
right.
and
That's
in
right.
France, you could go to the pre-Roman, to
Yeah.
Gaul or something, or Celtic society, but that's a bit of a leap.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that another element there too is that by this in the 1640s, that constitutional settlement that 1688 creates hadn't happened yet, right?
Right, right.
Whereas that is something that the American revolutionaries revere. They sort of look at this and saying like this constitutional balance between power and liberty. This is sort of what we need to restore.
Mhm.
And similarly in the Dutch Republic, but in other ways, and in Ireland as well. So you see that same dynamic pop up. Like we need to have this ancient balance where liberty thrived. And we need to, and that this is another thing, is that they don't just say we need to do it now. They say, no, we need to do this continuously. So if you look at the early Virginian Constitution, I believe, it actually says in it that there needs to be a regular recurrence to original principles. It's like in their Bill of Rights type thing. Like this is what you need to regularly do is restore and recover original constitutional principles. And this is also the reason why, if you look at Western liberal democracies right now, right? Everything from the United States to, somewhat westernized countries in Asia, and Europe, the one country where constitutionalism is so big is the United States. And there's a reason for it, right? It's embedded because the United States is the only country that survived the Patriot Atlantic phase. And it's embedded in its political culture that constitutionalism and its original force. And again, this is debated what that means, obviously. But the point is, it's in its culture, embedded in it in a way that just isn't the case in the Netherlands at today, right? People don't, well, they care a little about the Constitution, but not in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm Canadian, and most Canadians would point to could point to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is 1981, so it's not exactly an ancient document. But they wouldn't, but they don't revere it in the same way.
Right, right.
Right.
And then I think Canadians probably got a little bit of trickle down even from American culture just by sort of proximity.
Oh, sure.
Um,
Yeah.
but ask the average Czech, you'll you'll give it you get a different answer, right?
Sure. Well, yeah, there's definitely that connection, that cultural connection between the United States and Canada based, yeah, shared language, shared culture, not identical culture, but shared culture, and similar, uh, you know, similar, you know, colonial experiences, etc. That
Sure, sure.
um
Yeah.
connect them, and that makes there's a very similar way they view they're liberals in similar ways.
Absolutely.
They define liberalism the same way. I don't think they interpret that definition the same way, but they define it.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But yeah,
Yeah.
no, so anyway, so that's really interesting. So are you the Patriot Atlantic, you're saying, other than the United States, is essentially destroyed by the French Revolution?
Yes and no. Yes, in a sense, but also by uh, the choices made by all the patriots involved in the Patriot Atlantic. So what I mean by that is, so I personally think that historical actors have agency, right? They have choice. And what you see happening in in the United States is that Americans, so in my book, I have various chapters, but one of the, I think the second to last chapter is on constitution making. And so I discuss constitution making in all three places because in the 80s, the Irish, the Dutch, and the Americans all try to create a patriot constitution with the idea that finally, like, they've achieved their revolution, right? And now we have to actually do something, which is hard, right? Because they've been opposition, resistance, revolutionary. And that's like, yeah, we have one common enemy. Let's go for it. But
And we and
when
and
you really,
arguably very utopian.
yeah, right. Well, yeah, at least idealistic. I don't know about utopian, but
Yeah.
yeah, they were idealistic. Yeah, yeah. Um, And so what you see happening in these three places is that the American revolutionaries make a choice that the other two don't. I mean, the American revolutionaries have the benefit that they're not close to France or Prussia, right? So they don't get this invasion like the Dutch did. But neither did the Irish, right? They wanted to stay in the empire, so they weren't afraid of the British as much. So that doesn't count for them either. But what does count is the fact that the American revolutionaries say, look, we have lots of different factions in this movement. We disagree on many things, right? Madison famously writes in the Federalist Papers, right? He says, yeah, you have factions because that's part of liberty. That's part of having freedom is that people disagree, right? So how do you manage this? How do we manage here? How do we make sure that the country retains freedom on the one hand, but doesn't devolve into civil war, right? Because that was the real fear. It was the fear of the American revolutionaries. It was the fear of the Dutch patriots. It was the fear of the Irish patriots. The Dutch patriots were wanted to make sure that no oranges, no supporter of the stadtholder would ever really have any power. That's basically how they designed their political systems. The Irish patriots were terrified that the Catholics would get rights because they were the majority, right? And what would happen to their patriot based system that was kind of had large Protestant roots, right? But the American revolutionaries said, okay, we have all these different people, right? They also had big problems. They had slavery, massive dividing line, right? They had all kinds of issues, but they said, look, we have different factions. Let's manage that in this constitution with these balanced powers, right? Let's make sure we manage these factions. Let's agree to get along, essentially. Let's agree to compromise to keep moving it forward. And then you might think, well, what about the 1790s when there was partisan divides and Federalists versus the Democrat Republicans? And it was like people actually thought there might be civil war, right? The country might fall apart. But in 1800, you see that Adams, right, President Adams, voluntarily gives up power, transitions that power to the Democrat Republicans, right? This peaceful transfer of power between parties. And therefore preserves this, right? And you see Jefferson in his inaugural speech, he kind of acknowledges this. He says, we're all Federalists, we are all Republicans. He said, we're all men of the same principles, right? He says, we're all patriots. And that's something that the Irish and the Dutch could never really do. They refused to do it. They chose not to compromise with the people with whom they disagreed within their own movement. And therefore, once the French Revolution broke out, there was basically a large crack, right? And once the French Revolution broke out in North America, yes, you had the partisan system, right? You had the first party system, but it survived. In Ireland and the Dutch Republic, it didn't survive.
Hmm.
So that's how I would argue.
Interesting. And I mean, that is fascinating. And I mean, I think the I'm a little afraid to say that I don't want to over characterize it too much, or to mischaracterize it by saying that one of the differences is that one of them had James Madison.
Yeah, it had James Madison, it had George Washington, it had John Adams, right? It had
Right.
Thomas Jefferson, it had all these characters, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton,
Right.
this vast array of characters. But it wasn't just them. Think about the Anti-Federalists, right? Think about Patrick Henry, big time American revolutionary, didn't like the Constitution one bit. George Mason, he was at the convention, walked away, right? You had all these guys. They could have said, oh, let's start a civil war. Or they could have said, we will never agree to this. We will never agree to live under this constitution. They could have said all those things, right? This is the stuff that was happening and was threatening in the Dutch Republic, or you had people saying this kind of stuff, or in Ireland. And they did, right? The anti-federalists, the moderate ones, they got their Bill of Rights, right? They compromised, and that's how the Constitution was ratified. So it wasn't just them, and it was the country at large that then kind of accepted this writ large. But yeah, you are right. Like if there wasn't a Madison, right, you needed, and that's the interesting thing about the American Revolution, is that you had this inordinate group of talented individuals that that was sort of perfectly, I mean, in many ways, perfectly aligned. Not perfect, I guess, but they were aligned in a manner that made it work. The Dutch and the Irish had great leaders, very intellectual, excellent at mobilizing resistance, but they just weren't capable of bringing it all together practically. Because that was the big problem, right? Patriotism was incredible at creating resistance and revolution and opposition, but actually putting it into practice is hard, and that's where they diverged.
Hmm. And then I come back to this notion of temperament, right? That there's this, you look at the Constitution period, I'm always amazed by the willingness and spirit of compromise, of intellectual compromise. I mean, I think Madison himself, I can't remember exactly which Federalist paper, but says, talking about the Senate, and he says, I cannot justify this. Like the two states, every state, there's no aspect of political theory that could help me justify this. All I can say is we need to do it to get along.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There's no intellectual argument for this. All I can say is, we need to do it. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It needs to be passed, right? It needs to be, because otherwise we're end up in this civil war. Yeah, temperament. No, that's right. And then, I mean, you see this with the Dutch, right? They're obsessed with this concept they call eendracht, which is a very old-fashioned word for unity. And even in the Dutch Republic's motto, it was called Eendracht maakt macht, which means unity makes power. It was kind of like the unity of the 7 provinces is a powerful force kind of thing. That was the old-fashioned conception of it. But the Dutch are obsessed with this stuff. We need to be unified around one particular program, and I get to decide what that is, right? But of course, Madison's idea, and you see this, it's not just Madison, right? It's this whole group of people who say, well, look, you can't agree on everything. You can't be one program. If you're going to make it practical, you can't just be, because if you're doing resistance, you can say, yeah, restore rights and liberties. It seems like you're all on one front, right? But then once it actually becomes a practical thing, how does this work? You see the same thing with the militias. This is a perennial problem for all 3 of them. And the Americans solve this practically in the Constitution, whereas the Dutch and the Irish, they just let it run wild and they get into trouble over it,
Okay, can maybe go.
especially the Irish.
Yeah, can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so militias in the book, I go into this quite deeply. The militias are basically an essential institution of the Patriots in a way that the revolutionaries after the French Revolution are not, right? That you get the creation of national armies and the nation state and its connection of citizenship to the nation. But the militias are this very patriot, early modern institution. They see this as this decayed institution that is no longer invigorated by spirit love for one city or community. And so all over the Patriot Atlantic, these militias pop up and they're celebrated as the ultimate form of sacrifice and patriotism. Now, in North America, the militias are very useful because there's a war. So they're basically just functioning as they should. You get a bunch of guys and you give them guns or they have their own guns and they fight and they win or lose, right? But what happens in the Dutch Republic and in Ireland is that they basically become armed political resistance groups. And they're pretty effective at first in sort of creating common cause, creating pressure on local governments or on the British government in the case of the Irish. But what ends up happening is once they get what they want, and this is especially true in Ireland, where the Patriot Revolution just sort of falls apart under its own weight, is that um, they don't just don't have anything to do because there's no more war. The war ends with North America and with France. They are kind of extra legal there, so they're called volunteers, and they're called that for a reason because they're not technically legal entities. Um, and so these militias, they are just seen as bothersome, right? They constantly show up when there's like they need to make a decision, like that constitutional stuff I was talking about earlier, these constitutional conventions. You have these rowdy militias showing up and trying to pressure the constitutional convention, but that's annoying. Like after a while, if you're the patriots and you're in charge, you don't want to have your own guys showing up with the guts, right? So, and in North America, you see similar problems in the 1780s before the Constitution. You have mutinies, you have rebellions, right? You have unpaid soldiers that rise up. And so the Constitutional Convention, the Constitution nationalizes to a large degree the militias. This was a huge complaint of the Anti-Federalists. They said, "Oh, we don't want the government to take control of the state militias because that's the state's privilege." But Hamilton particularly says, "No, no, 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 that's going to be fine." Madison says, yeah, don't worry about it. If you want to overthrow the federal government, you still have your guns. Like you can't, And then this is a famous piece in the Federalist Papers that gets cited these days, in Second Amendment type issues. But then ultimately they concede and they add the Second Amendment in there, right? The gun rights element is added specifically in the Bill of Rights, as it was in states' Bill of Rights, specifically because this was highly valued by the patriots at the time. And so again, you see here how they kind of compromise between the two, right? They restrain the federal government on the one hand, but empower it on the other. Whereas in Ireland, it's like this extra legal group that does nothing. That just becomes this loose political pressure thing, and it just doesn't go anywhere. And in the Dutch Republic, they just get crushed by the Prussians. But they would have been a similar problem. Right? What are you going to do with these guys? Right? It's not an easy thing. Like once that institution is there, how are you actually going to use and employ it?
Right. And if you're not going to employ it, what are they going to do?
Exactly. Right. I mean, the Patriots were all about, yeah, let's invigorate citizenship, but at a certain point, people get bored by doing weekly exercises, right? There's a limit to that.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. So we see these movements that emerge in Ireland, the Netherlands, and the United States.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that these are the three places that that these patriot movements have the most flowering, for lack of a better word. Are there movements like this in other places?
Yes, there are. So there in the late 1780s, you see an revolution emerge in Belgium, adjacent to the Dutch Republic, 1788. These guys rise up against the Austrian, because he was controlled by the Austrian Austro-Hungarian Empire. They rise up against the Austrians. They fail, but they briefly create a country called the United States of Belgium. And they fail for similar reasons that the Dutch patriots and the Irish patriots failed, that they couldn't bridge the gap between their more progressive patriots and the more conservative patriots, and couldn't really do the same thing that the Americans did, what we just talked about. In Geneva, in Switzerland, similar. 1780s, late 1780s, before the French Revolution. They're a group of middle class. They call them représentants. They start a revolution against the more French aligned group there, but they get crushed, similar to the Dutch patriots. The French actually send their troops that just got back from North America. They use the same troops that helped the American revolutionaries. They crush these guys. And ironically, those guys, these Genevan patriots, they move to Ireland, create a colony called New Geneva, back- um, where they try to sort of recreate this, imaginary space. And it fails completely. They get into beefs with the Irish Patriot Parliament. But yeah, those would be two. And then actually, I would say France, 1789. There's strong elements of patriotism there, but there's also hints of early radicalism already. And that's basically what the hints that Burke is referring to, right, in these reflections, is that he's kind of seeing that already. And it's like I said, you could argue one way and say if you were living in 1789, you could have said, well, Burke was being way too, aggressive on us. But looking back, obviously he had a very perceptive insight into these nascent radicalisms.
Interesting. And what's interesting is, or I mean, all of that's interesting, but one aspect is that, with the exception of France, Belgium, Ireland, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and the United States are all decentralized political have decentralized political histories.
Yes. Correct. Yes.
And so that scene is that, I mean, we talked about this a little bit last week, but is that a major part of the connective tissue?
Yes, it is. That is exactly what it is. Yeah, that is exactly. And this is why it fails. I mean, it fails in Switzerland because of invasion. It fails in Belgium because of disagreement, but it fails in France because of that. That's why it does. That's why patriotism gains no traction, because it has no meaning there. Like I said, there's no history of liberty, but there's also no history of, local rights and privileges.
I mean,
Right?
les parlements don't really count, you know?
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could make the I mean, that's what some patriots might have argued, but like, yeah, it doesn't, like, what are you supposed to do? Just give the Parlement all powers or something? But what does that even mean in practice? It just doesn't make any sense. And it wasn't the members of the Parlement that were really active in trying to get the powers back, right? It was just a bunch of guys in Paris trying to, and the socioeconomic differences are huge, whereas that is not the case in all these other places, right? The France class differences is massive. The aristocracy was powerful, and that just isn't the case. So you have that history of decentralization. You have that history of a relatively large middle class, and you have that history of liberty. That's just lacking.
Right, so they're not social, they're not social wars in the same way that the French Revolution becomes.
Exactly. Exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, because it's the mob that takes out that goes to the Bastille, right? It's the mob that unleashes these, and they're upset about grain prices and all these things,
Right.
right?
And I mean, the Sons of Liberty are not a mob in the same way that you've got the mob in Paris.
Right, exactly, because the Sons of Liberty mobs were largely controlled by these middle class genteel guys, right? There were some overlaps, right? But at the end of the day, the American revolutionaries said, "Well, we let the mobs go here, but we also have make them stop here at a certain point," right? So there was certain mob dynamics, right? And there's no question. I mean, if you look at more progressive historians of the American Revolution, right? And progressive historians, neo-progressives, they've like Gary Nash, they've written excellent, very, very interesting histories of the American Revolution. And what you basically see in those histories is that they highlight these sort of, lower class dynamics of the revolution that were more radical, right? And they were more radical for a reason. But the problem is they don't get or the difference is they don't get the upper hand, right? Like you see this, like there's people who want to abolish slavery. They want to do this, they want to do that. But the abolition of slavery happens typically gradually, right? If it happens at all, right? In France, though, it's the pressure of this massive mob that gets the upper hand. It's the Jacobites that are able to capture that mob and turn it into political power in a way that the American revolutionaries or the Dutch patriots or the Irish patriots or the Genevan patriots never did.
Hmm. Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time. We've taken up a lot over the last couple of weeks, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But have you got any final thoughts? When is the book expected to be out? Or
Published?
yeah,
Yes. I always like hearing Canadians say out.
yeah.
I actually noticed you were Canadian last time when you said I'm sorry. So I thought, oh, you must be.
Well, you know what? That's funny when even somebody when even someone who's Dutch is able to pick up on the
The accent.
the dialect differences between being Canadian and American there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, my sister lives in Canada, so
Oh, okay.
I know a little bit about it. But sorry, what was? Oh, when is the book coming out? Yes. So it should be out. And this is for those of you who are listening. Sorry to this is going to sound weird, but it's going to come out very soon, between quotation marks, in spring 27. So it's going to take a little bit, but that's just how academic publishing goes.
Sure, sure.
It's been reviewed, and I'm currently revising the introduction and some things, but it's on the way. So spring 27, year and a half. Well, yeah, probably a year and a half ish from now.
Do you have a title?
Yes, it's The Patriot Atlantic: The Dawn of the Age of Revolution. That's the title.
Love it.
So Patriot Atlantic, you've heard it a lot. You'll see it in the book. It's coming out with University of Virginia Press.
Excellent. Well, here's the thing. Once this podcast has a massive audience by the spring of 2027, we'll have you on again to talk about it.
All right. Well,
All right.
keep working on those audience numbers. All right. Take care. All right. Thank you. See you later.
Bye.